and kick it off. Welcome everyone to our second event in our joint series with Hyland. Today we're going to be talking about data activation, unlocking and activating the data trapped in your OnBase records. My name is Claire Douthit and I'm a member of our marketing team here at DataBank, and I'm joined by Patrick Higgins, who is our Director of Database and Development Services, and Rick Billier, who is our team lead. So Patrick and Rick, if you all wouldn't mind just giving a quick introduction. My PowerPoint seems to be sticking, which is not ideal.
Sure. So I'm Patrick Higgins, as was mentioned, Director of our Professional Services Group, specifically over our specialty services, development, database, data migrations, and infrastructure. My background is I've actually been in the document management, content record management space for a little bit over 17 years now. 10 of those years working at Hyland Software on the healthcare vertical when they first started it up to when they were into the hundreds of hospitals that they had. Here at DataBank for right around 7 years. Rick Billier, who is on as well, is a member of my team. He works on the database team performing customer reports, data migrations, and so much more for our customers. Rick, you want to give a little intro on yourself?
Sure. Rick Billier, I'm the team lead for the database services team. As Pat mentioned, my team does database consulting, database setup, reporting, as well as data migrations and extractions. I've been at DataBank for, it's a little under 7 years now, but been working in the EDMS space, mainly with OnBase for over 20 years now.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. Quick reminder before we move into the rest of our presentation for today, and I seem to be having some problems with my PowerPoint. Hold please for 1 minute. Sorry about that. Here we go. It's just a little bit delayed. So quick reminder, this is the second in our joint series with Hyland, and the fun continues after the holidays. In January, we're going to be digging into WorkView and workflow. We'll be talking about those a little bit today as well. And then in February, we're hosting a panel about OnBase enterprise migrations. Our team works with that quite frequently, and so it's just going to be a review of some lessons learned and how we can help you sort of sidestep some of the challenges that we've encountered. And then in March, we have our cloud readiness workshop, which we're also really excited about. There's a lot of discussion around cloud, and we're really encouraging all of our clients to really think about the cloud migration and what solution is best for you. So we're going to be digging into that specifically with Hyland GCS in early March. All of these events are open for registration, and you all will receive an email after our webinar today with a recording of today's session, and you'll also have the link to go ahead and register for our upcoming events as well. We really hope to see you there. So a quick overview of our agenda. So today we're talking about data activation. Our goal is that we know we have a really heavy OnBase, we have a heavy group of OnBase users in DataBank, and we know that it's a system that's very highly integrated into a lot of your systems and processes. And so what we're here to do and what we're talking about today is how we help you better use that system and how we can help you understand, what type of information is in your OnBase records and how do you activate it? How can you pull it out of the files and documents that you have stored and put it to work for your organization? So we're going to be talking about what is data activation, which is where Patrick is kind of our guru on that here, as well as how we help you take your data to the next level. How do you get started once you kind of arrived at the point of, okay, I'm in OnBase and I feel like that's running like a well-oiled machine, and I want to talk about how I better use my system. The bulk of our time today, we really want to be a Q&A, so we hope that you've all come with your burning questions on your OnBase system. We're here to answer and are really hoping for a very thoughtful and impactful discussion around data activation and on OnBase. So let's go ahead and start with our first poll question for today. Just to take a quick kind of survey of our group today, we'd love to know, in thinking about how you're using OnBase currently, what are some enhancements that would be the most helpful for your organization? Is it managing processes? Is it eliminating repetitive tasks? Or maybe it's understanding and extracting analytics from your data? Or is it integrating with third-party applications? We will give this just a few minutes. Looks like our poll has been launched. And we will take a quick survey of that in just a minute. All right. Looks like we still have some respondents. All right, one more, so we'll give everyone just one more minute and we'll share our results. Okay, looks like analytics and managing processes along with integrations. Analytics kind of seems to be the winner here, but we're also pretty evenly split, which is interesting. So thank you all for your participation. We are looking forward to digging into all of this with you today. To kick us off, let's talk about your data. Let's talk specifically about data activation. Data activation is a term that we've sort of coined here at DataBank. It describes a group of services that we use, and a lot of those integrate directly with OnBase. And so Patrick, I'd love if you could just take us through really briefly, what do we mean when we're talking about data activation?
Sure. So, you know, the first bullet in the list is the one that I tend to think about the most, and that is, you know, someone has an OnBase system or maybe a SharePoint system or some other content repository in their environment, and they're storing information there because they have to have storage. They have to have the ability to retrieve it. But what are they doing with it beyond that? Is it just kind of stored and then collecting dust? What historic information is being reviewed to know how the business is performing, to know where there's room for improvement, maybe challenges that are being overlooked, opportunities that are being overlooked? And if the system is being viewed purely as scan, store, retrieve, which is often the case is an entry-level point to having an OnBase system or some other type of content management system, that's where things tend to go. Now, for more advanced users, they'll tend to have processing set up as well, where they're not just scanning it in and indexing it, but they're actually running it through a workflow engine. They're handling claims, they're processing HR files for compensation increases, for performance plans, for interviewing applicants. They could be running logistics workflows for seeing how supply chains are functioning. But again, if it's just hey, we had this content, now we want to wrap a workflow around that content where it comes in and we move it here, we move it there, and we have people look at it and click some buttons, that might ultimately feel like a bit of a clunky process. It could still feel like you're manually handling that paper, except you're not getting the paper cuts. It's been stored electronically for you, but you're not having anything done for you. You're still having to handle it yourself. Other areas, well, OnBase can help with security, it can help with compliance, but you know, if your OnBase system isn't talking to the other systems that you have, if you haven't done any kind of automation with the data, if you haven't looked at that data to see, you know, what is it? What could we do with this data? What additional knowledge can we glean from this? You know, you'd have a lot of opportunity of where that system could be taken from where it is today. And when we talk about data activation, it's really going beyond those initial stages that a lot of people tend to go through with OnBase of it's scan, store, retrieve, it's an archive. Oh, we can do some workflows. We want to handle those workflows. Well, we want to start talking about how do we link it with your other systems? How do we automate those processes? How do we help you gain additional business intelligence from that data that you have in your system?
Great, thank you. It sounds like, when we're talking about data activation, we're talking about a specific set of services, but it's also something that's really customized, right? Because it's all depending on what are the processes, what are the uses and functions that we're looking at. So I'm excited to talk more and maybe get some customer questions today around some specific areas in their business that they want to learn more about how they can integrate these services.
Absolutely.
So yeah, a couple of use cases that we have been thinking through, and we're talking about use cases. I think here specifically we're looking at some outcomes. So Patrick, can you illustrate for us what are some of these outcomes that we can expect from integrating data activation services with your OnBase system?
Absolutely. So if we talk about just interconnecting different systems, let's talk about the healthcare space. Oftentimes when it gets to patient claims and patient billing, the documents will be stored in OnBase, but all of the other insurance information is stored somewhere else. Well, if we can interconnect those systems, you could have your medical claims billers looking at a claim and have a button that they can easily click on, and up pops the document that relates to that claim, where they can fill in additional information. That can go for the medical coding, that could go for the billing, that could go for the patient's treatment as well. If we're talking about logistics, insert different application names, but it's the same concept. You could have a line of business application that you're working in to control that flow of freight around the globe. But if you need to see the bill of lading, if you need to see the invoices, if you need to see the tracking data, having an integration where you can click and see that information is incredibly handy. But sometimes it's not even about seeing the bill of lading. If that document went into an OnBase workflow where people are making decisions on it, what they're doing is they're setting keyword values in OnBase. Maybe from that integration standpoint, you just need to see what the decision was, and that decision is stored in OnBase, but the people making actions from those decisions are working in a different system. So we can have an integration to push and pull that data back and forth to make it easier for one person to just get their job done without having to log into 3 and 5 and 10 systems and look for that email that was sent that was a forward from 5 different people to find the thing they're looking for. Just have the data there at your fingertips. Now, consolidating your systems, this is really where data migration services and data extraction services come into play. I'll tell you that, look, we've been guilty of it at DataBank too, and I'm sure others are as well, of, hey, there's a shiny new system, we have an introductory rate, let's go ahead and buy that system, and we're using it in HR, and hey, there's a different system and we're using it in accounting, and then here's yet another system where we're using it in our professional services area. And all of a sudden we have a bit of a mess on our hands where content's just stored everywhere, whether it's 1,500 SharePoint pages that all have documents stored on it, but no usable metadata. If it's one person's using OnBase, another group is using Application Extender, another group is using something else, another group's using Google Drive, you can get into a situation where you've lost control over the inventory of your systems. You just have too many owners, too many maintenance bills. You don't know where the data is, and that makes it so much harder to integrate the data, because now if you're talking about a line of business app and a records management app, well, really what you could be talking about is 3 line of business apps and 10 record management apps, and you're not integrating 2 systems, you're integrating, it could be 3 times 5. It could be a lot worse than that. So sometimes it's worth it to slow down, stop, take inventory of the systems that are out there, ask the hard questions of, does this system do the same thing as that system? If they do, can we consolidate? Well, that's something that DataBank can help with. If you identify that there are systems that you need to consolidate from, they could be legacy sunset applications that you just haven't turned off, or it could be that scenario of everyone has their own thing. We can help liberate that data from various systems and move it to the right destination system, giving you a simpler footprint, a simpler infrastructure footprint to then build those integrations from, and to use that data then for driving key decisions. That's the analytics and the business intelligence. Same thing as the integrations. If your data is in 35 different places, that's a lot more reporting effort you have to do than if the data is in 2 places, 5 places.
Great. Yeah, I think each of these are so relatable when it comes to just trying to find information. There's so much of it these days that it really is important to have one repository and one system that's talking to every other application that you're using. And we all know that those monthly fees and those maintenance fees can really add up when we have several different systems that we're looking at. So let's talk a little bit about, what are the specific services that we include in this idea of data activation? I think workflow and RPA are two that we get a lot of questions about, and it's something that we're really invested in leveraging for our clients. And so let's talk a little bit about what does workflow and RPA mean in the context of data activation?
Certainly. So with workflow, and again, the kind of the entry level place that a lot of people start with workflow is recreating their paper-based world. I have my content, I'm moving it to this queue for somebody to look at it and rubber stamp it, move it to the next queue, and someone's making a decision there. But where we could really go with workflow with a process automation, and when we say process automation, we're not talking about, have an electronic representation of your paper-based world. We're talking about a scenario where there are rules and actions being taken without a human having to do it. The data is being evaluated, whether it's by an OnBase engine or something else. If we're talking about handling claims that are above a certain dollar threshold, below a certain dollar threshold, making decisions on that in an automated fashion. In the commercial retail space, we've seen certain customers that have identified that returns that are below a certain dollar threshold actually cost more money to fight than to just accept the return and move on with their life. Well, we can set up for some analysis to find those business cases, but then also some workflow engines to evaluate and handle that work for you. On the RPA side, so robotic process automation, just to dispel any buzzwords that might be out there, what this really can come down to is you may have a task or 5 tasks or lots of tasks where someone in your organization's job is to get that report on a Monday, download it to their local machine, open that spreadsheet up, add some filters, add some columns, delete some stuff that they know always has to be deleted, then upload that to a different spot, maybe turn it into a portal, maybe turn it into a PDF report. Well, with robotic process automation, those types of repetitive tasks can be programmed and run by a machine instead of having to be run by a person. Now that person can focus on what else is there to do in the business beyond just these repetitive tasks. But another nice aspect of it is you can go a little bit deeper where if you have a person doing those tasks, you might be thinking about how much time do they have in a day and what's most critical for them to do. Well, in RPA, if you start taking those time-consuming tasks off that person's plate, you can then start asking, well, time's not a factor anymore. It's machine processing time. It's not human work time. It's not 9 to 5. What additional data points can we pull from this? What additional processing can we go? Can we go deeper than just what's mission critical?
And from what I understand, when we're talking about RPA, there's kind of 2 flavors, right? There's one that's a little bit more focused on the desktop side or maybe client side, and then there's server side. Can you explain the difference between the 2?
Absolutely, and I'll tell you that oftentimes it'll come down to different vendors for RPA applications, depending on if you're doing client side or server side. Client side stuff actually tends to be the scenario that I was just painting. Server side tends to be, if you think about in an OnBase world, you might have batches of documents that get uploaded to, let's say, an SFTP site. And while there's lots of tools that can do this, with an RPA tool that is a server side tool, you could have it managing all kinds of different batch queues to grab those files, to run pre-processing logic, to make copies of it and move it into different locations. And it's at that point, it's less about mimicking what a human is doing as a manual task and more about automating large moves of data, large alterations of data. But it can still do some of that manual representation too.
Okay, thanks. That's a helpful distinction. So a couple more areas when we're talking about data activation. Analytics and business intelligence are kind of 2 sides of the same coin, so we tend to look at those in a similar manner, as well as AI and machine learning. Now, for our purposes today, I think that workflow and RPA may be a little bit more relevant, but I also know that analytics is hugely of interest to our audience today. So Patrick, can you tell us a little bit about analytics and business intelligence and start getting into some of the machine learning uses within data activation?
Absolutely. So you're right, analytics and business intelligence, there's certainly some overlap in those terms. What I'll tell you I tend to think about is, more often than not, if someone's talking about those things, what they're really saying is there's more about what my daily function is than I recognize. There's more going on in the business than we know. We know we can improve, but we don't know how. We know that there's something that is probably broken, but we can't put our finger on what it is, and we need help inspecting that. And really what that means is, again, if we were to use the OnBase world example, you might have reports today that look at how many documents were scanned today, or how many uncommitted batches are out there, how many batches got indexed today, how many documents are sitting in this queue or that queue of workflow. Well, that's today. And tomorrow it's going to look a little bit different. And the day after that, it might look even more different. At the end of the month, which we just went through and all businesses go through, it could look wildly different because end of month closeout can have a lot of additional curveballs thrown at it. Well, when we talk about analytics, we're not talking about the snapshot of today. We're talking about looking at the history, looking at how it always is, what the averages ultimately are, what are the patterns that occur over a duration of time, to then start to identify those key areas for addressing. It might not always be an issue, but finding places of efficiency that could be improved. Where business intelligence, where that term tends to come into play for me, and what I like to explain to others is, if you give me a report of just numbers, I can look at that and I can tell you the patterns inside of those numbers, the averages, the highs, the lows. But if I don't know if that's a logistics company, if it's a local government, or a box of crayons, I don't know anything about that business to help go beyond, here are the patterns I'm seeing. So if we really want to get serious about analytics and business intelligence, it's both looking at the data, writing reports about the data, but it's also spending time from a business analyst standpoint and understanding the business, really asking the big questions such as, what matters most? What are the key performance indicators? And now how do we pick that data apart to line up with those key performance indicators? As far as AI and machine learning, I'll tell you that machine learning is a term that gets thrown around quite a bit, as is AI. They're not necessarily the same thing. In fact, I'll say they're not the same thing, although depending on what article you read, it might infer that they are. Machine learning, once again, you can think of as being almost like a repetitive task engine, where the example that's often overused, and I'll use here as well, is you're indexing documents and you are trying to train the machine to recognize an invoice versus a purchase order. You're trying to recognize a patient discharge summary versus a medical lab result. And what we're really talking about there is pattern recognition. We're teaching the machine by giving it samples and saying, this is this, this is this, this is this. Now I'm going to give you more samples. You show me that you can recognize those samples. Where artificial intelligence is different than that. Now we're not talking about just pattern recognition. We're actually talking more along the lines of true decision making. When we get into analytics and business intelligence, a lot of times AI and machine learning is offered up and is asked about. I'll tell you that normally at the entry level, we don't start there. That might be a conclusion point where we'll go, where machine learning might be something we want to inject in to how the data gets into the system to help improve the efficiency and improve the quality of it. And then on the artificial intelligence side, that's something that we kind of wait until the end, because if we don't understand the business to offer intelligence about it, there's no hope of us programming a machine to do any better. But that's not to say that an AI engine can't then take the reports that we've generated and some input that we've provided and start to make additional suggestions faster than a human can looking at those reports.
Okay, that's helpful. I appreciate that explanation. Thank you. So now that we've gone through some of the specific solutions within data activation, I know we're probably going to have some questions and some people wondering, how do I get started? I mean, this is all, some of it's very complex technology, and how do we, if we're in the space of, we know that we're ready to take a next step, or we want to start exploring how we integrate RPA or how we integrate workflow, what are some tips to make sure that when we begin discussions, we're kind of getting off on the best foot possible?
You know, and I've mentioned it already in this presentation, but just to repeat it because it's important, know what matters most. What are your key performance indicators? And what I really mean by that is, you might have 5 and 6 and 10 different metrics that measure how a person is doing, that comes up in reviews and reports. But from a business standpoint, ideally you have similar metrics that explain, well, is a business performing well? Could we review ourselves with this information and of that, what actually is most critical. So like here at DataBank, we care about customer retention. We care about having a high NPS score, review score from our customers, and we care about net new logos, getting new customers in the door beyond just the existing ones. And we can identify those things as goals, and then we can measure ourselves against that. Everything else can roll up to that. How many hours did it take to close the support case? How often do we do data migration services? What type of integrations have we sold? All of that stuff kind of rolls up to those performance metrics, and it's important. But at a core business organization purpose, let's start with defining what is it that you care about most, and then we can work our way backwards and we can define how to fill that information in. Another thing that I've mentioned in here is the inventory. You, just like us, just like everybody else, you probably have lots of data and it's probably scattered across multiple systems. It's pretty critical to know where everything is, know what those systems are, know what's contained inside of them, be able to identify what's most important of it. So it takes time, but having an inventory, not just of the vendors that you do business with, who are you paying bills to from the accounts payable department, but really what is the application, who uses it, what is it used for, what is housed inside of it, and what do we see as being most critical. If you can have that inventory, it becomes very easy to then take some self-reflection and say, well, what of these systems are redundant? What of these systems are serving just one problem, and we have administrators and infrastructure and annual maintenance and all these other things going on just to do this one function, and by doing it in this isolated spot, are we slowing ourselves down because that's not tied into anything else? Those are really key things to do, which is why I feel having that inventory is important. And then really getting back to the key aspect of measurement. So we talked about the top tier things. What do we care about the most? Well, you need to do the same thing at the department level. What matters most to the company is important at the executive level. But again, using DataBank as the example, our accounts receivable department may not necessarily have the same goals as landing new customer logos, as NPS scores. They're handling the dollars going in and out. That's a critical thing. How do we measure them? We don't want to forget about them. How do we measure them? How do we measure HR? How do we measure each department? But not just a measure of, are you doing good? Are you doing bad? But really a measurement of, what is it that you're doing? How are you doing it? Is there an opportunity to do better? Is there something that you're doing that maybe we don't need to do? We've been doing it just because we've always done it, and we don't actually need to keep doing it.
That's great. Yeah, I think with each of these, it does sound like it's a lot of just taking stock and evaluating, what does the best look like for our department? And I think that those are really fun, reflective questions to be able to dig into when you're thinking about implementing change like this. So I'd love to pass this over to our audience today. We promised you that this would be a Q&A, and so we have arrived at that portion of today's webinar. So please submit your questions through the Q&A, and we will be on hand to answer them. Here's one, and this is one that is a good one to kick us off, I think. So with pricing, can you give me an example of what does pricing look like? Like, are there any scenarios that you can share to give us an idea of what we could be talking about here?
Absolutely. So the pricing was somewhat generic. So I want to touch on 3 target areas. So we've talked about integrating systems. We've talked about consolidating systems, data migrations, data extractions, and we've talked about analytics, so reporting and business intelligence. So just to kind of give a high level of each. Each one of those can be a bit of a rabbit hole, but I want to give the high level example. So integrations, as a for instance, something as simple as an OnBase external autofill keyword set, where you have a system set up where you're indexing documents. You have users either manually or semi-automated fashion indexing documents coming into OnBase. They fill in a primary keyword, they hit tab, the secondary keywords are automatically filled in. That autofill kicks off. You can have an external autofill set that is querying a third-party database, or it's running a script and using a web service to call a third-party system. Something that simple technically is an integration, and doing something that simple could be as little as $500. You know, it kind of depends on how simple the equation is. Now, on the flip side of that coin, we have had customers that what integration they wanted was borderline replication of the OnBase Unity client as a standalone custom viewer with its own workflow buttons, with its own panels, with its own keyword panel, with its own notes panel, that was callable from one cloud engine to another cloud engine, doing a backend API that was for retrieval, for adding index information, for driving workflows. Obviously, that's more complex, so the price is higher. We've had integrations easily be in the 20, 30,000 range. We also have products, integration products. So like, for example, DataBank has a Salesforce to OnBase integration where your users, if you use Salesforce, you could be in Salesforce, you can do document retrieval, you can do document upload, you can generate e-forms, and some of those other underlying functions like autofill sets are available as well. Well, that's a product that we sell that has a product price tag and recurring annual maintenance. And the annual maintenance there really is more of a, sometimes you want something custom that's a one-off and you're happy to pay as you go with it, but other times you want a line of business app, a critical line of business app, to have support associated with it. You want to know that it's being updated as new versions of Windows and Salesforce as OnBase come out. So there's maintenance with it. That integration, if I recall correctly, is in the $20,000 price range, which is comparable to integration costs from Hyland, depending on which integration we talk about. Data migrations. So whether we're extracting data and just delivering it on a hard drive, or we're actually doing an end-to-end move. So pulling data out of FileNet or Application Extender or some homegrown system, massaging that data and injecting that data into, say, OnBase, for example, but also we could inject it into SharePoint. We could inject it into a whole host of other systems. That is volume-based business. While Application Extender versus FileNet have different complexities, while working with SharePoint has different complexities, we kind of bundle those complexities up and we look at just how many documents, how many pages, how many gigs, how many terabytes, and we price it out in a volume-based business. Now, I will tell you that if we're talking about an automated data migration, we tend to find that for most customers, it becomes cost effective if they have over 1 million documents, over roughly 10 gigs of data that needs to be migrated. When I say cost effective, well, our cost to engage to perform that service, our floor tends to be in the neighborhood of about $30,000 to run that work. And there's a cost threshold there where, let's say you had a system that had 2,000 documents in it. There's no service that we can provide from a computer program standpoint that's going to be faster and cheaper than hiring a couple of temps to come in and print and scan. And I'm not a fan of print and scan, but I'm just saying that there is that volume threshold. If you have just a stack of papers on your desk, there's no reason to bring in a whole services engine and a whole program to do that. You just need an intern or somebody to pick up that stack of papers and scan it. So we've had data migrations that have been in the realm of $30,000. We've also had data migrations that are like the state of Texas level, north of 10 terabytes of data that have gotten into the 7-figure realm. Now those, we love having that kind of business. If you have that stuff, we'd love to talk to you. It's not an everyday thing, and I don't give you that price to scare you off, but it's to let you know that the volume is what's critical there. The amount of content you have, we can help with. What we do find with customers is more often than not, the system that's being eliminated, the annual maintenance that's being eliminated with whatever system, as well as the infrastructure cost, is more per year than our one-time data migration cost. So that's the thing that you really want to evaluate, not just how much does it cost to move this data around, but what are you saving? And then from a data activation standpoint, what can you do with that data now that everything's in one place instead of 15 places?
Yeah, that's a good point.
For data analytics, data activation, I'll first admit that we're somewhat new in this space where we've been operating for years, mostly in a consulting fashion. So you have a need for some kind of report, we can step in and we can help craft that for you. Well, that need expands to, well, you don't want it written necessarily in OnBase report dashboards. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you want to use something like Microsoft Power BI. Maybe you want to use something like Amazon QuickSight, Salesforce Tableau. We help with that stuff too. But historically, we've always been doing it in a consulting fashion where you know the report that you want, or at least you have an idea of the report that you want, but you might not be familiar with the tools. We'll step in and we'll help build those for you. that becomes a time and materials engagement. But where we've been going in this space is having a time and materials engagement still, but one that's focused on what data do you have and what can we do with it? Can we extract it out? Can we house it in a data warehouse? Does that data warehouse need to be on premise in your site for security reasons? Are you more cloud savvy and you want to have it in the Microsoft Azure hosted data warehouse cloud? Do you want to have it in something like Amazon Redshift? We can set those things up for you. We can host them for you if you want. If you have your own cloud hosting contract, you can host it and we can consult with you in getting that data moved. Then we can get into writing reports against that data. And from a business intelligence standpoint, as I've mentioned before, to me, that requires a lot more time on the business analyst front, sitting down with you and seeing what's important. And again, time and materials engagement in those places. I know I went way overboard on the answer, but it was kind of a high level question. So I'm hoping that it helped spur some additional questions.
No, I think that's great. And like we've talked about, I mean, these are not rinse and repeat solutions, and we're not doing a lot of apples to apples comparisons. So I think it's helpful to understand all of the different variables that we look at. We did have another question come in. Connie May had a question. If you could just dig into pricing for RPA just a little bit more. And then, another thing that we can also do, Connie May, is we're happy to schedule some time to maybe discuss this with you in more depth. But Patrick or Rick, could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So we have a couple of options with RPA, and let me first lead with it. As I mentioned before, there's different tools. So we are an Nintex partner. We have Nintex certified engineers in our professional services stack, and there's a Nintex RPA tool that we can use. There is a OnBase RPA tool. We have people that have been through training on that as well. We can provide services on that content. And there's a couple of other vendors out there as well. And I don't want to spend too much time delving into that. What I would actually rather understand is the problem that you want to solve with RPA, because it, much like with a custom integration of the other things we've talked about, the business need turns into how complex it is, which turns into us better understanding what tool to offer you, and then being able to explain, what level of effort is needed to build that offering for you.
Awesome, thank you.
I will add, though, what we've seen most often is if you're talking client-side RPA, so I have repetitive tasks and I want the machine to do the repetitive tasks for me. Client-side RPA tends to be far less expensive than machine RPA, where that really is meant to be a service that's running, tens of hundreds of thousands of jobs concurrently. So just one differentiator to call out there.
Okay, that's helpful too. We do have another question that's come in, but before I do, just a reminder, you can drop your questions into the chat feature and we can pick those up from the chat as well. We want to make sure we don't miss any of your questions today. So next up, let's talk a little bit again on the more like practical application side of things, but let's talk about implementation time. Again, these are services that have a lot of different variables that we're working with, and they're so often just based on the end result and the outcome that we're looking to. But can you give us any type of, rough ballpark or understanding about implementation time with some of these different services?
Sure, absolutely. Let me first say that the implementation time will vary. And what I really mean by that is, think about right now, it's end of year. There are lots of customers out there, especially on the government side, but not exclusively, who have budgets that they're trying to burn through, the use it or lose it. So we can have some peak amounts of work right now where time to start, time to engage could be a little bit longer. We have natural lulls in the cycles as well when customers tend to be going through budgeting cycles. It's something that your account manager could absolutely help talk to you about to better plan when you want to start a project up. But what I really want to go to beyond just that thing where it could be the difference between 1 week and 3 weeks is there's time to engage and then there's time to implement. And the big differentiator there is, let's take data migrations as a for instance. If you have 2 terabytes of data that you need to be extracted out of system A and moved into system B, we might be able to engage in a week or 2 weeks to start conversations with you, but from that conversation could turn into a lot of homework for you. That homework turns into, well, you have over a terabyte used over in system A, Do you have that much hard drive space already available in system B? Because when we do a migration, we're really copying. We're not deleting as we move it. We want to leave the source system intact until we're done to be able to go back and validate against it. So do you have that additional space? If not, how long does it take to acquire that hardware, to get it stood up, to have your IT department available to wire it in? When we engage in data migrations, 95, 99% of the time, we're working in your environment. It's often something that customers ask for, but are also happy that we do. Your data never leaves your network. So we need to have a staging environment set up for us with our tools on it. How long does it take for you guys to set that staging environment up for us? So for an engagement standpoint, what we'll often have in our contracts is not just a time to engage, but what we'll include, and data migrations is a great example of it. We have a checklist of, here are the things that we'll need to have in place for us to hit the ground running. We can engage tomorrow. We can engage next week. We can engage at the start of January to have conversations with you, to answer questions, to say hello. But until all of those bits are in place, there's not a lot that we can actually do. Now, once everything's in place, once we have all the bits lined up, that's when things really start to fly. And that's true with development services for custom integrations. That's true with analytics as well. On the analytics side, having that, we might be contracted to come in and help you guys with analytics and business intelligence. But if you haven't done that inventory yet, that might slow us down a little bit, where we could say hello a week in, 2 weeks in, but then there could be a bit of a pause there. And I hope that this information helps.
I think it helps. I mean, I think, it's always good to know that homework will be given to you, but that it's also going to be, very critical to the success of the project. So let's talk a little bit more about data analytics. We've had another question come in. So again, this is something that we know is really of interest, but so this question, what system should be used when we're talking about data analytics? I hear about Google, Amazon, Microsoft.
Yep.
Can you provide some clarity on that?
So I will tell you first, and then I'll explain. It doesn't matter. That's really the secret answer. So this is iPhone or Android. It's, what is your preference? It's do you prefer Abercrombie and Fitch or Walmart brand clothes? It doesn't matter. It's, what is your preference? What I really mean to say behind that is, myself personally, I've been using Power BI and I've been using Amazon QuickSight quite a bit in the last few months, flip-flopping back and forth between them depending on what client needs are out there. They look different because they're written by two different companies. They do the same thing. There might be one feature that Microsoft has today that Amazon doesn't. Tomorrow, Amazon's going to have it, and one more feature that Microsoft doesn't. These are the cutting edge tools. They're getting updated rapidly. Features are being added rapidly. The same is true with Google. The same is true with Snowflake. The one thing I will say with Snowflake is, so let's compare Amazon to Snowflake briefly. With Amazon, if you want to do real cloud analytics, you're going to be spending time getting an AWS engineer, probably a security engineer as well. They need to set up your storage, which would be an S3 bucket, typically Amazon buzzword for online hard drive. You are likely going to be setting up some type of database or data warehouse. That could be Redshift. It could be MySQL. It could be Postgres. It's really what you choose to go with. And then once you have that, you have to load your tools in, and you have to use a different set of Amazon tools, Glue or Lambda functions, to move that data around. Then you can get into their QuickSight tool for their reports, their dashboards, all of that. With Snowflake, that's more of data warehouse and data analytics as a service. They're doing a lot more of that back-end infrastructure type stuff for you at a higher cost. But they're doing that back-end infrastructure stuff for you to make it easier to such a degree. And I haven't done it personally, but I've been through a couple of their presentations. The way they kind of list it is, you give them your data and they will make it available to you to write your reports against with a fun, easy tool. But if you are a shop that already has people working in Microsoft Azure, you already have AWS engineers, these things that I've listed out might be very tiny hurdles, speed bumps to walk over. They're not real cataclysmic things that you have to deal with, but that's a big difference between, say, Snowflake or a big platform vendor like an Amazon, like a Microsoft. Now, if you have an interest in Amazon and Microsoft and the things beyond Snowflake, using other tools to drive your business, web hosting infrastructure as a service, and content repositories, TextRack for doing image processing, whatever the case may be, which again, Microsoft has some flavors there, Google has some flavors there, IBM has some flavors there. Whatever the case may be, those are situations where we are happy to help and consult because we're using those tools too. We're building solutions with those tools. We're doing consulting for other customers as well. So we're happy to help there. But at the heart of the question of what is the right platform, it's a completely subjective question. It's really what is your preference? I will admit my preference. I kind of like Microsoft Power BI. I've grown up in the Microsoft SQL Server space. I am Microsoft certified. So there's a comfort level there. It has nothing to do with it being a better product. It's just my own personal comfort.
Yeah, that's good to know. And I think that that's good to kind of present those different options. So let's look at some new questions. Okay, this is a great question. So Rick and Patrick, can you help me make a business case for these services? I want to explore data activation and I want to better understand what I can expect.
So if we were to talk about first on consolidating systems, the thing to expect is, again, knowing that inventory that's out there. What are all the systems that you have that we want to consider consolidating? Another thing to expect is, and this can feel a little bit like playground sandbox stuff, but you might identify that there are 3 redundant storage systems and there's room to decrease operating costs by consolidating. You might identify that there's room to activate our system by having one storage repository to integrate with to report against. But the owners of those systems might not agree. They might feel that their system is king and the other ones are the redundant ones. So beyond that inventory, there's going to be a point in time where you do have to sit down and talk to the people that use it and bring them on board. And the flip side of that is pitchforks and torches, and they're calling for your name in the streets. We don't want that. So sometimes that decision's made for you. A great example is when a platform is sunset. Hyland Software, for example, has acquired numerous companies: LibertyNet, Perceptive, eWeb, which is a healthcare hosting platform. Whole host of applications have been acquired by them. DataBank has acquired some companies. And oftentimes with those acquisitions, there's a point in time where you determine, you know what, this is redundant and we're even competing against ourselves, one platform versus the other. We need to sunset them. When a sunset date is laid out, you could think of that as being the marker of this is a system that we should get off of. It's not a panic. Oftentimes the sunset date is given with years in advance where we're no longer doing enhancements, but we're still doing bug fixes and security patches. And 2 years from now, we're no longer doing bug fixes. We're only doing security patches. And some period after that, we're going to stop doing security patches. Well, that gives you a roadmap of when you got to get off of that platform. Now, while you might still have some people that love the platform, it's not their choice. The choice has been made for your organization by someone else. Sometimes it could be something, and I'm not a FileNet hater at all, but I've been on the receiving end of business from FileNet customers who have been through a scenario of we've reached the maximum 2 billion document content in FileNet. They're making us rebuy our solution to keep going, and that's just too expensive. We need to go somewhere else. Once again, a decision has kind of been made for you, and we can help with that. But if we're not talking about sunsetting, if we're not talking about a vendor giving you sticker shock, it really comes down to that inventory and that decision to consolidate. For integrations, my personal preference is start small. If you have different systems, you might want to jump right down that rabbit hole and say, I want the world today. And what oftentimes can work a lot better is choose the most likely to be used functionality and let's integrate that one thing first and get the users comfortable with it. So now your user community will be asking for more, as opposed to a scenario where the user community could feel like you're shoving change down their throat. They don't like change and they don't want change. I'm probably not telling you guys anything you haven't heard before. On the analytics side, this is one where it is good to have business owners involved, but oftentimes this tends to not involve the end users. It doesn't involve a need to get a copy of your systems. And to give an OnBase example, so if you have a report today that's looking at scan queues, how many things are out there to be indexed today? How many documents are in this initial workflow queue? That gives you your today snapshot. When we want to do analytics, we want to look at the history, as I've mentioned before. What are the patterns that happen as opposed to the here and now? That often requires looking at the OnBase transaction logs. Credit where credit is due. OnBase has some incredibly well done transaction logs, tons of data, a lot of detail around one action versus another, timestamps, you name it. The downside is those tend to be the biggest tables in the OnBase database, and for size reasons, they're not aggressively indexed. There's not a lot of database performance aspects for querying the transaction logs. They're written to capture data. Think write to often, read occasionally. Well, in a data analytics business intelligence standpoint, this is where a data warehouse really comes into play. Is we would want to take a snapshot of that huge transaction log and copy that snapshot to a different database engine. That way we can query it to our heart's content without ever putting the user community at risk. We're never kicking off a query that grinds the machine to a halt. The same is likely true with the other applications you guys might be using. So from an analytics standpoint, know that it'll be pretty quick to realize that, you know what, we should have a singular data warehouse where we're culminating all of your line of business apps into one spot so that we can query it. We don't impact users, but we also have all the data in one spot to report against instead of having to tie into 5 and 6 live systems.
Okay. Thank you for that. So it looks like we have one final question so far. We may have a few more come in. We have a few more minutes left. But okay, so let's talk about quickly this question. So data analytics, basically what this user is wanting to know is if we're running with data analytics, why is it making my system so slow? Like what can I do to kind of speed that up, and how can I make improvements on this?
Yep, so that does tend to be also the data warehouse answer. If you are running analytics against your live production system, which lots of people do, it has a cost associated with it. If you think about users that are looking for one document here, one document there, the database is optimized for that type of operation, for opening up workflow queues, for opening up scan queues, for writing content into the system. And then along comes the data analytics report that is querying all of the content of 5 different huge tables with no real filtering applied to it to get bricks of data out of it to then do some massaging with. That absolutely has a cost. It absolutely can impact users. Could the queries be optimized? Yeah, absolutely. People run reports against their production OnBase systems every day. But there is a threshold. There is a point where you have to make the decision and say, you know what, it's time to not eliminate, but it's time to make a copy of this data and have it somewhere else. And to dispel a buzzword, because I've used it a couple of times now, a data warehouse at the end of the day, in the context we're talking about, is just another database. If we're talking about OnBase again, we might want a copy of all of the transaction log tables, the item data table, the keyword tables, maybe a few configuration tables to be able to match a user num to a username, a document type num to a document type name, things like that. Well, if we pull that data out of the OnBase database, we got to put it somewhere. The most logical thing is let's put it in another database. You know, it's already a database format. It's already a database table, columns, you name it. It's already right for it. If you stood up a Microsoft SQL server in your environment, if you stood up a MySQL server in your environment and copied that data in there, and the purpose of that database was just for analytics, just for you to go in, or a team of data scientists to go in and pick that data apart, guess what? You've made a data warehouse. At its simplest form, you've made a data warehouse. Now, if you're using cloud engines, so again, using Amazon and Redshift as an example, it is a database platform. It's based off of Postgres for those database nerds out there that know a couple of different platform names. Based off of Postgres, but Amazon actually said, we want this thing to be the best data warehouse possible. We're stripping out the features that are for concurrent user function, and we're enhancing this thing to do bulk data loading as fast as anything can, and bulk data querying, individual user bulk data querying as fast as anything can. And they actually have something really cool there. And the cost entry is tiny. The last time I looked at the cost, it was in the neighborhood of $1,000 a year for a terabyte of storage on servers that I have been shocked by how fast they can load in hundreds of gigs of data. Like in seconds, they can load in hundreds of gigs of data and spit results back out from a querying standpoint. They have the ability to scale up. They have the ability to scale down. Again, that's for those of you that are looking at cloud options. You want to go in the direction of the cloud, or maybe you're hardware limited and the idea of standing up another database server on-prem is a bit difficult to swallow versus a monthly subscription or an annual subscription. But yeah, ultimately, if you park it in another database where you can run your reports against it, you're going to have a better experience in that regard.
Great, thank you. I'm going to do a final call for questions. It looks like we may be winding down just a little bit. Give it a couple seconds. Any other questions? All right, it looks like that is it for today. Of course, if you do have more questions, you know, our team is ready to sit down with you and discuss anything else you'd like to dig into further. Thank you all for your attendance today. Thank you for Patrick and Rick for joining us and diving into these topics with us. And you all will receive a copy of this recording and our presentation deck later today. Thank you all.
Thank you.